It's a great pleasure to introduce the chair and moderator of the session, José Carrera of the CAF, Development Bank of Latin America. José.
Thank you, gracias. ¿Se escucha? Do you listen to me? Good afternoon to everybody. Perhaps I need a mic. Aló. ¿Me escuchan ahora? Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon to everybody.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's very hard to hear. Let's see if I can get my microphone on. I hope it's better now. Once again, thank you very much for your attendance at this last session. These have been 2 very intense days of looking at topics, a variety of topics, all very important for the region, and we'd like to close out with this last panel in which we will talk about perhaps one of the most important topics for the development of Latin America, which is its cities. I'm going to speak in Spanish, and when I give Danny Leipziger the floor, I'll switch.
In the States, so please. En todo caso, el panel que queremos hacer.
At any rate, today's panel is on cities. We're looking at this in a region where cities are at the heart of the development agenda. The growth of our cities has created challenges in terms of inclusion, productivity, reducing risks, and our cities are also the ones that have promoted great innovation in order to improve the quality of life of our residents. The purpose of this panel is to have a dialogue about what has happened with the development of Latin American cities in recent decades, to hear about some success stories and innovations that have helped us to have smarter, safer, and more climate-resilient cities. By way of introduction to this panel, I'd like to share some thoughts on urbanism in Latin America. Latin America is perhaps the most urbanized region of the developing world. More than 80% of us who live in Latin America live in cities, and those of us who do live in cities, 25 or maybe even 50% of us live in precarious neighborhoods, and this is something that we really need to think about. If we want to have our region develop, we need to look at where people are, and they are in cities. Therefore, our land management approach is very important. We must also acknowledge that Latin America is a region that has made important strides, and we heard this yesterday from the CAF president during our opening session. Poverty reduction is very important for all of us. This, along with poverty reduction, in which more than 50 million people have moved on to the middle class, we also see a reduction in inequality. And this is perhaps one of the few regions of the world in which inequity has shrunk in the past 15 years. However, we continue to be the most inequitable region of the world, the region of the greatest inequalities. And the most visible face of inequality is found in social exclusion. When citizens are excluded from services such as clean drinking water, good housing, health, education, etc. Therefore, if we want to have an inclusive agenda as an organization and as a society, we need to think very seriously about inclusion. It is also important to acknowledge that Latin America is a region in which cities produce 2/3 of GDP. 77% of the GDP generated in the region is associated with cities. Therefore, not only because of where the population is, where people are, we also need to look at this because it's where a lot of the jobs are, production, and wealth. So that is another reason that cities are so important. Also, we're looking at a region that's very young. Between 2025 and 2030, we believe that the economically active population of Latin America is going to increase tremendously, and this will only work if this great human capital can be fully linked into production, and unfortunately it doesn't seem like it's going to happen, particularly the youngest people who have much higher rates of unemployment than the rest of the population. And we see phenomena such as the Nini, those are kids who don't study or go to work. And 2/3 of them are women, so gender is also a factor here. So these are the elements I wanted to place on the table for the discussion this afternoon, and I'd like to invite our distinguished guests to speak to us about equity and inclusion, citizen security. We saw this morning and yesterday as well several mentions of crime and security in the region. We also want to look at risk reduction, productivity, connectivity, and of course, in order to do everything that we want to do, we need to have money. So we also want to talk about financing what we want to do. To start, I'd like to invite Aníbal Gaviria to speak. He was the former mayor of Medellin, Colombia, and also a former governor of Antioquia. His city has undergone tremendous experience in these issues of inclusion. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Aníbal, and I'd like to ask the other colleagues to participate very actively. So we hope that this will be a panel with a very fluid dialogue. All right, Jose, thank you very much. And first, I wish to thank the CAF, the Dialogue, and the OAS for this invitation. And additionally, I would like to thank, as all of us on this panel, thank you for including cities as an important part of this program. That marks a change in the view of and role for cities in multilateral organizations and in the world in general. I welcome and thank and congratulate CAF for this initiative because, as Jose has said, and I think it's been repeated many times, but it is worth repeating, ours is a world of cities. It's increasingly a world of cities. Today, there are 7 billion people on this planet, and 50% of us live in cities. That means 3.5 billion. But projections by the UN is that by 2050, there are going to be 10 billion of us, and 75% of us are going to be in cities. This means that over the next 30 years, we're going to move from 3.5 million to 7.5 million people living in cities. In 30 years, in other words, we're going to more than double what it took us all of these millennia to do in terms of city growth. This implies a tremendous challenge, and at the same time, a major opportunity, because I think that cities are mankind's greatest invention in certain ways. And they are the potential generators of some of the biggest solutions. So as I said, so I like this introduction into the discussion about cities. I'm fully convinced about their role, and it's increasingly important on a world scale. So I'd like to get into the topic that you have suggested, Jose. I think that the two biggest problems of Latin America, without a doubt, and of Colombia and Medellin as well, are inequality and violence. We are the most unequal place. We've made progress, but we're still there, and we're also the most violent. Yesterday we heard about the horrible figure that some 43 of the 50th most violent cities in the world are in Latin America. For Medellin, for example, and you might remember in the 1990s, we had the highest homicide rate of any city in the last 50 years. It was 390 homicides per 100,000 population. When you look at murder rates, it sounds very cold. However, just imagine a metropolitan city as big as Mexico, which has some 22 million population. And then if they had the same rate as Medellin in the 1990s or 80s, that would mean there would be 80,000 murders a year. And now, compared to another city, about 14,000, and there may be 50,000 homicides if we were in the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires. So that just gives you an idea of the dimensions of the crisis Medellin was experiencing. And in terms of inequality, just to give you a measure, extreme poverty at that time was 19.4 times. I'm not talking about just poverty, extreme poverty, abject poverty. So up until 2015, when my term in office ended, the figure was completely different. We were at the top of the list of the most violent city for more than 15 years, and now we're out of the top 50. We have 20 homicides for 100,000 population, so more than a 95% reduction. And extreme poverty is at 2.8%. If we continue at this pace over the last 4 years, by the end of our term, extreme poverty may disappear. But that's not the arrival point. Buenos Aires, Santiago, they have homicide rates below 5 per 100,000 population. But the important thing there, as is true for Latin America that we heard from Luis Carranza, is the progress we've made and the further progress that we can make. Now, with this outlook, which we're presenting to the world very proudly from Medellin, the interesting thing is not so much a description, but rather a formula. Yes, how did you do it? What was our formula? And everyone asks about that secret sauce, and I say that it's not, they seem to think it's done magically, but there are some conceptual ideas and some more concrete ones. And I'll try to talk about both of them in conceptual terms. Without any doubt, such a transformation cannot take place within a single administration. It requires continuity, and the president himself also mentioned this yesterday. You have to have stability. The formula that I've tried to use to describe what occurred and what we did, what many of us did in Medellin, is several successive good administrations that were working in harmony. So we're not talking about a single messianic leader, and they have different mayors, different parties, different individuals in office, but we have followed the same line of government with successive good governments. That's been given us continuity.
What is important is to have articulation. Same as many other cities with us and other important cities in Latin America and throughout the world, we're not just a city, we're metropolitan areas where several municipalities converge. And we were discussing this earlier with Fernando during lunch. The true reality is the city. The fiction is the municipalities, but those political fictions sometimes interfere with the realities of the city. We must seek out formulas to articulate our work, and we have explored them and have made some progress around them in Medellin and in the metropolitan area, which is made up by some 9 municipalities. Continuity, integration, stability, in order to bring about transformational results. In order to go to some concrete aspects within the development of all of these concepts, let me go back once again to the issues of equity and inequality. We deal with violence because violence is a different means of inequality. It is inequality with regards to the right to life. In order to attack inequality, another formula which many people don't like, and I believe that this calls for continuous work and effort to carry out our task. That formula, as far as we're concerned, is equity, is spelled with an E, such as in education, E as in public space, espacio público in Spanish, and education, which is the simplest formula to bring about equity. There are, of course, other aspects as well, which I could likewise mention as we continue on with this panel session, but I would like to expose the point for now, something which is not that logical when we look at the budgets and the decisions made by the administrations. The public space is the space of equality. There, all citizens are equal, and Medellin has indeed adopted a simple formula, but which is indeed very important, by building public spaces of quality, such as parks, public schools, public universities, what we call UVAs, which are the units for articulated life with cultural space and community activities, and something which is the main public space and which we sometimes forget, which is that of mobility, because mobility and around mobility is something that uses more of our time. The traffic jams, where half of the life of our citizens is spent, sometimes a very poor life with very poor quality. We must try to reduce that time and have better quality as far as this mobility is concerned. And another important value as far as mobility is concerned is that it unites other spaces and it allows the citizen to enjoy those other public spaces. This is why we have emphasized mobility by way of our metro system, the metro cables, the rubber wheel tramways, as well as different modalities in the same transportation system. And thirdly, of course, employment. Employment as it relates to the previous factors, as we forge ahead toward better levels of education and generate a competitive platform that is more suitable in cities. We are thus facilitating what the President mentioned yesterday, which has to do with productivity and the generation of more employment and employment of better quality all the time. Thank you, Aníbal. Let us move on to Daniel Martínez, who is the intendant of Montevideo in Uruguay. He has been the Minister of Energy and Mining in his country. And we would like, Daniel, for you to tell us from the perspective of Uruguay and Montevideo, what are the steps that you are taking in your office in order to better the social integration and cohesion at various levels, also including gender policies, the inclusion of minority groups, working with the young, as well as the technology with which you have much experience. Go ahead, Mayor. Hello, I would like to say hello to all those of you. With regard to your question as to who was going to do this, I must highlight necessarily the role that CAF has been playing throughout this process, especially in Uruguay, where it has contributed to much of that which we are discussing today, trying to bring about a collective dialogue. Uruguay and Montevideo is indeed a different country, a different city, of 94% urbanization. Practically nobody lives in the countryside in Uruguay. We have a Gini index which went down from 0.45 to 0.38, which is the lowest in the Americas. So we have 92% of sanitation services. We have water and electric energy everywhere, and there has also been growth and real development, which has been valued by economists, and which is above 40%. However, challenges are tremendous because the problems of inequality are not just problems of that which one has access to. I worked very much working on the ground with the people in the country. And I spent many years as an engineer in a private company. And back in 2005, I went into engineering and I left that activity. I continue to love it, but I cannot practice it. But I have gone to homes of people who were there 6 or 7 years ago, and they live in better conditions. Instead of having one person working, 3 of them are working. Real wages increased by 200 or 300%. But we must see what is the true projection of democracy. Everybody, in accordance to their wish to struggle in life, they can try to reach their own goals. But when you live in places where there is difficult accessibility, and for an ambulance to reach the car, the police car to arrive, or the fire brigade, whenever the educational centers are far away, when public transportation means that the kids will have to spend hours upon hours on a vehicle to get to school, or where the hospital is far away, you are not having a true solution of a serious problem. Although you have solved other problems, but you require to have this element of equality as far as the mobility is concerned. So a strategic planning system is necessary. I do not like speaking about a plan, because strategic planning calls for constant reorientation in keeping with internal and external conditions and go toward long-term objectives. So we have managed to forge ahead, and as you said, district of Casabache, we had a very good experience, which allowed us to tackle with many elements. We formed what we call Sacude, which is the name of a dance, by the way, shake. It means health, culture, and sports, Sacude. There is a hospital, clinic, which is in charge of the superintendency. They're teachers of fitness, basketball, soccer, their cultural activities. By the way, our country has incredible cultural riches. The number of theaters, libraries that we have is truly amazing in all districts. But we try to bring to the districts of greater social growth an integration of the people. But this is not sponsored by the mayor's office. What the mayor's office does is contribute with the resources. The neighbors are the ones that take care of this experience. We're now having the second of these efforts, and the idea is to bring about the various elements required for total inclusion to carry out this effort in a wholesome way and not just partially. Besides Uruguay, we have had 4 and 5% reduction. From 4 and 5% diet poverty, we're going to 0.8 and 0.7 in the last 2 or 3 years. However, there's still locations, especially where the crisis and economic policies and the facts determined that the decade of the 80s and the 90s, a very important sector of the population was not able to pay for the cost of living in the central areas of the city, having public transportation, sanitation, and so on. So they had to go away from the city at a great distance, where there was no sanitation, where there was no electricity or drinking water or public transportation, which brought about the problem of urban counter-planning or city planning, which is very serious. We have a system that classifies the city in various areas or various zones, areas which it shows which areas have sanitation and which don't have it. But by doing this, we had to allocate resources together with the Ministry of Housing for the relocation of people, especially those who are now polluting the water streams because they don't have an adequate classifications of residue. They just separate that which is useful and they discard that which they don't need in the water streams, and this generates a tremendous environmental problem. Infrastructure has also been mentioned. There are districts to which it is difficult to get to. So now we have partnership through which we have groups that go to these popular barrios where we have now lighting, sanitation. We have a trust fund, and we also have rainwater and so on. All of this is put to the service of integration. We also have the area that has the largest number of personnel in the mayor's office is culture. Then next we have environmental development, cleaning and sanitation, and that is very good because culture in Uruguay is a very important element of social relations. Also, we have the Teatro Solís, which is just turned 160 years. You're familiar with it. We danced the tango this year, 100 years after La Comparsita was written, a famous song written by an Uruguayan, but it was played by an Argentine together with the boss of Fernando. Now, let me just say that there's a big surprise. After this panel, we have prepared a tango group which is outside for you to give us a show and tell us how to dance. Yes, Horacio learned it and we can dance together. I perhaps dance a little bit better. We dance at the door of the Teatro Solís, but also we have the policy of bringing culture to those districts and to generate culture in them. Another very important issue in the case of Montevideo has to do with two elements: to control, measure, and we're working with the experience in Buenos Aires having control boards, dashboards, and also bring about methodology, having Wi-Fi in the plazas and in the parks in the city, in the squares, and to broaden possibilities. We have something very clear in our minds. The riches of a nation, as cities play a basic role because much of the internal product is generated in cities. The riches of a country is not so much its natural resources many times. Many of the countries have had much natural resources, but they have not used it adequately. Riches of a country nowadays is the average knowledge of a people. To understand clearly that we cannot generate a tremendous separation because of problem of values, but from the standpoint of the development of a country or a nation, the great distances between the social sectors result in a social sector which may not have its knowledge requirements met, and the population thus will have to struggle to have a better position. So technologically speaking, we're doing many things as well. Mobility is indeed an important element. Today we have 30% of the traffic lights which facilitate mobility. Next year we'll have 70%, which means 15% less in moving from one point to another because the lights, the traffic lights are synchronized. The reduction in the number of deaths and fatalities and serious accidents. We also have a minimum network that is being extended in other areas. 85% of the lady, which is an intelligent network using a computer from this global management center regarding the intensity and the lighting in plazas and other places, the control of the Wi-Fi. We have quality of water, quality of noise in the city. We're working with the local staff and together with the young, by the way, sensors in order to identify when there is a problem with trash container, that the trash collection trucks will not go there where the dumpsters are empty, only go there where they are full. And luckily, we have many efforts underway, and we're hopeful that we will continue to forge ahead, because the idea is to have a comprehensive and intelligent city open to the world for coexistence, where public space and much of the investment is being carried out in quality public spaces to bring about the social integration, always wagering that Latin America may be able to make progress and will be a land of joy and pleasure, but also economic development. That is wonderful, Fernando. The issue of the riches seen from the perspective of education and the actual quality of human resources in their training and skills, public spaces, once again, and culture are relevant. I would like to ask Fernando, who is the Secretary General for the city of Buenos Aires, a city, as we're all familiar with, which is wonderful, very large city in Latin America, and he was one of the founders and executive director of CIPEC. He also worked in multilaterals, PIDES, and it is a pleasure to have Fernando among us. Fernando, tell us from the perspective of Buenos Aires and your own experience, these issues of inclusion that they're dealing with in Villa 31 are very important programs in the case of bringing people from the country to the city. And tell us what you're doing by way of inclusion in Buenos Aires. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I lived in this city for many years. It is always beautiful to come, as Michael Shifter said yesterday, to this Washingtonian tradition of the CAF conference. It is the first time that I'm talking before you. The problem with these panels is that make us think about the socks we're wearing, because you're going to be looking at them, and then what we're going to say besides. Together with Aníbal and Daniel, we share many feelings that goes beyond Carlos Gardel, whom we have shared in several versions of Medellin and Montevideo. Cities are the great stakeholders of this new world disorder. Therefore, the importance and the merit of CAF in having established this panel. For a day and a half, we were trying to decide what was that new order. While this is happening, cities are portraying not just endogenously with the challenges they all have, but promoting that new world order where there are new problems, new issues. In the cities, there are urban trends having a global impact. Just to think about the issues having to do with migration, the jobs of the future, social integration, as Pepe was telling us earlier. So much so that on the occasion of the Argentine presence of the G20 being held in Buenos Aires, other countries which pertain to the G20, we have promoted what we call the Urban 20 Plus, a space that will bring together cities of countries members of the G20, as well as other cities for countries which are not G20 members, in order to discuss topics of urban agenda which have a global impact. And then President Macri, as chairperson of the G20, became committed, and also as former mayor became committed, as I say, to give the chairpersons who will be in session at the end of December. The only G20 president who was a mayor was Erdogan from Turkey. This is an interesting piece of information. And among those important city subjects, we have social integration, obviously. Most cities in Latin America and also throughout the world have been working for a time in resilience strategies. Resilience is precisely, in today's panel, it refers to those phenomena which are disrupted and which take place every so often, such as Hurricane Irma, or what happened in Houston a few days ago, and how cities are prepared, infrastructurally speaking, vis-a-vis such phenomena. But there is also a new conception of the resiliency of cities, which has to do with the sustainability of community lives, where social integration plays a basic role. Social integration is affecting cities, with social disintegration, without discriminating according to income levels, because the most challenging districts in Buenos Aires or in Medellin share with Saint-Denis in Paris the problem of the integration of the young Muslims, or in Calais or in Berlin, the 50,000 refugees which come in every year and which challenge that policy of coexistence and housing in Berlin. Social integration has to do with the resiliency of the cities, the sustainability, as well as the new global order which we're trying to unravel. Buenos Aires indeed is a city which shares that challenge, and having a very eloquent and clear dynamics, because Buenos Aires is the city where 4 of the 5 unicorns of Latin America came up, those companies of over $1 billion, and we're very proud of that, and this is due to the policies of innovation and human capital. There are also 250,000 people, less than 10% or 5% of those of us who sleep in BA, because you have 3 million inhabitants during the day, but 6 million during the day. 3 of those million sleep there. There are also a large number of people who do not have the same rights. Many of them are located in 5 or 6 of what we have historically called the villas of the city, which the most important of which is Villa 31, Villa 31. That district that you see from the highway when you're going to the city, one of the most expensive areas, only 100 meters from the most important shopping center in BA. Alcalde Algareta, now with those links we have with the national government, could transfer that land to Buenos Aires, but Mayor Larreta decided to work with a short vision which can be included in 6 words, that this become one more district in the city, so that people will have the same rights as regards public utilities, to be able to pay for their land and their improved housing. But basically, and that's important as the 2 former points, that Barrio 31st, as we call it, may become a public space where people will go and where the neighbors that come around also go out to do their business. Very few of you who have been in Buenos Aires did ever think of going to Barrio 31. Probably you have a certain bias as to what it is because you're not familiar with it. The mayor established an office in the middle of Barrio 31 to monitor the whole process of integration. He likewise decided to bring the new headquarters of the Ministry of Education to the city, where about 2,000 people work, to the center of Barrio 31st, and to thus complement the most urbanistic recovery of these barrios, which means paving, having electric grid to improve all the services, improve the homes, with a supplementary vision of economic development for that area. Shopping centers, restaurants, places which outside Barrio 31, for which you would pay a large amount of money to go to. Thus, and having taken inspiration from the example of Medellin in Colombia, we like to speak about urban integration as a higher stage of urbanization, because integration means that one day each one of us will have a true reason to participate in the community life of Barrio 31st, as we do in many other districts. So I believe what is important is that this road from where you see Barrio 31st in the distance, actually fragments life in a place where there's no public space because it is used for housing, that it will become eventually a park. And all the road that separates it from the barrio will be a green space that will multiply sevenfold the space dedicated to number 31. So instead of moving away the people that live under the highway, we will move the highway to let them stay there. We will follow the railroad tracks, which is about 300 meters away, by having the road be built on top of it. So this has to do with our new vision, our new approach to government. And as Daniel was telling us, competitiveness in many of our cities, particularly Buenos Aires, cannot be just wagered by bringing the next GE plant or whatever else. It must allow to generate conditions of talent so that activities, intensive activities, knowledge-wise, may take place in the city. And when I say generate these conditions of knowledge and talent, it's not just the university compound, which is very dense in Buenos Aires. We have 500,000 university students, 160,000 of which are dedicated to applied sciences, but also generate conditions to attract more talent. Our mayor likes to say that we do not have to be concerned generating the conditions of the city so that Mark Zuckerman may want to live in Buenos Aires. Behind that, something positive will indeed come. We have 170,000 foreign students studying in Buenos Aires, not only because the education is a good quality and free as well, brothers and sisters from Latin America and other latitudes, but also because Buenos Aires is an important city. It is important because of its cultural activity, such as New York or Los Angeles. The public spaces, we see the democratization of the quality of public goods. The department having 1,000 meters, another one with just 100 square meters, difference is tenfold. But if they share a public space or quality, that difference is reduced. And the best program we must have in Buenos Aires is that of being able to walk on the streets. And with this, I conclude my presentation to take care of security and safety in a much broader way, going beyond the police control. We have to improve professionalization, working strategies, of course, of our policing, and we could discuss this later on. But security and safety means to establish conditions for having a better pact of order and coexistence in the public space, where the police perhaps takes care of the order, but civil society also plays a role, which is that of coexistence. There's part of the life in a society which cannot hinge just on the punitive aspects of the state by punishing the person who is throwing away trash, but just we must make certain that we use several initiatives generating better levels of coexistence in the city. That's all.
Fernando, muy interesante el tema de la integración.
Thank you. That's been very interesting, integration with the public space. And I'd like to stress the effort to create these spaces. For example, in a road or a neighborhood in Caracas, density per hectare is around 600.
Mientras que en la zona formal, o pongámoslo en Manhattan,
In a formal area, let's say that in Manhattan it's 300 people per hectare. So the importance of the public space, once again, is a way to give back to this sizable social group a place where they can hang out without having to pay, and they can all feel on an equal footing. It's very interesting. I'd now like to give the floor to Danny Leipziger. Many of you are familiar with him. He's
if I'm wrong, is Professor of International Business and International Affairs at George Washington University, and actually he's managing the Growth Dialogue. Danny previously served as Vice President for Poverty Reduction and Economic Management at the World Bank from 2004 to 2009. He also has served in some senior position in USAID and in the Department of State. Danny, The growth dialogue have promoted an interest in discussions about inclusive growth and productivity. From your perspective, what are the main elements that must be promoted at the local level to increase productivity, to enhance economic growth and quality employment? And by the way, we were having this panel about smart cities. What do we mean by smart cities? What do successful interventions look like? Danny, please.
Well, thank you, Jose. Thank you for allowing me to speak in English. In Latin America, I speak Spanish, and here I speak English. And so thank you for inviting me for this panel. So let me start from the back end about the smart cities, which was the subtitle of this program. So I think from our perspective, there are three parts to being a smart city. One is to use the most up-to-date technology and tools, and I think people focus the majority of their attention on that. The second is to involve the citizens in whatever you are doing, and we have a lot of mayors who know that. And the third is to have an effective government, because at the end of the day, as you said, inequality, there's income inequality, and there's also inequality of access to services, or inequality of transport, inequality of housing. So effective governments can use these technologies. The problem is it does no good to have sensors if you don't respond. As heat maps can tell you where the people are living and where they're going to be working, but if you don't have a good transport system, it doesn't help. So I think smart cities have these three elements, right? They involve citizens, they use the tools, and they have effective delivery. In terms of making cities more productive, which was your original question, we're very interested in that at the Growth Dialogue, because we think that cities are the motors of future growth, and particularly middle-sized cities. It's true in Latin America, but it's true elsewhere. So the question is, how do you make cities more productive, right? And so there are many, many aspects of it. I think if you start with the function of government, the city management, very similar to managing countries, there are a series of things that need to go well, right? And if you focus on one intervention, but you don't do the other 10, you're unlikely to be effective. So we tend to look at it from the strategy, making your city more competitive, to planning, coordination, effective execution of policies, bringing in citizens, and delivering well. So I think there are many cities that do this well. We have some on the panel here that are famous. I was telling Aníbal that 20 years ago we only spoke about Curitiba. Now we only talk about Medellin. So they're doing obviously a lot of things right. So to increase productivity of cities, there's the basic function of government and delivery of service. And then there's the question of how do you make cities innovative, and how do you attract, and I think Buenos Aires, you were using that as a good example of how do you attract people. There's a very interesting index that's produced in Washington by a think tank looking at the economic innovation of states in the United States, right? And it's no secret that there are Eastern Seaboard states that are much more productive, much more innovative, attract different firms, et cetera, et cetera. And they have various, factors that lead to the innovativeness of states or locations. And I think to make cities attractive and productive, you essentially want to attract new firms. I mean, new firms are the firms that create jobs. They're the ones that are going to apply new technologies. The existing firms are comfortable with their market share and may not be the innovators. So that means that to make cities competitive and innovative, you need to be able to attract these new firms, new entrepreneurs, higher productivity firms. It's no different really than at the national government level, right? You have the same set of challenges. It's just you have a smaller environment in which to deploy them. So the interventions, are many, but they're complementary. And that's why I'm saying you have to do a lot of things right. And so if you look at Medellin, they did a lot of things right? They had incubators, they had citizen involvement, they had good delivery of service, et cetera, and they had a plan, a vision of where they wanted to be in order to be competitive. So I don't think it's rocket science. On the other hand, it's very difficult to implement because there are vested interests in cities, just like there are vested interests in countries that prefer the status quo. And you would like to encourage these new firms to enter, and you'd like to give them venture capital, you'd like to connect them to universities, you'd like to do all these things, and you'd like the citizens to be involved. So we have fantastic examples around the world of digital connectivity, of citizenry, reporting service outages, commenting on, what needs to be done. The question then is, does government effectively follow up, and do they deliver on what they've promised? So I think there are a lot of lessons from Latin America. There are a lot of lessons actually from other cities as well around the world. And I think the most successful cities are ones in which the national strategy and the city strategy are aligned. I think it's very difficult. Just like within the city you want to be coordinated and aligned, you also want the city's strategy to be somehow aligned with the national strategies. And so I spent a lot of time working on Korea. Korea is a country that has developed its secondary cities extremely well as part of an export-oriented strategy. It's delivered infrastructure services to these cities, and it's been very successful. And it's managed more or less to avoid some of the mega city problems. Seoul, is the mega city, but economic activity and people are relatively well dispersed in secondary cities, and the new kinds of production and technologies that Korea wants to get into, when you get past the cars and steel, is very conducive to secondary city a division of production. You can do it with modern disruptive technologies. You can do a lot in smaller agglomerations of economic activity. So the idea that you have to have a Jakarta in order to be successful, I don't think is true anymore. So I hope that responds.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I would like to add a little bit on your comment of the importance of attracting new firms and, of course, new people that is engaged with the development of the city, trying to bring new ideas, being innovative, very important. But, of course, ahora voy a cambiar a español para...
Sí.
Now I'm going to change to Spanish for the last speaker, who is Minister Carlos de la Torre, Finance Minister of Ecuador. For everything that we've discussed, we need money, and there's an interesting topic here that was also mentioned by Danny, and that is that we need consistency between central government policies and cities. In the case of Buenos Aires, we have perfect alignment of the stars. We have the President of the Republic and the head of the province and the mayor. They all follow under the same umbrella and political leadership. But you might not necessarily find other places in which you would ask the minister, what's the role of a ministry within a context of providing financing to help out cities that are a significant part of the country's ability to develop appropriately. Thank you, Jose. It's not just that you need money, it's not just money, you need efficient management of resources that is not just limited to financial resources, but economic resource. And that's perhaps where the question comes up about what does a person who's responsible for the macroeconomic management of cities. I'm not an expert on urban development. I understand a little bit about what needs to be done in terms of providing basic services in cities. but many elements that tend to bring about well-being for citizens, but that's from the perspective of what we call the demand side in economics, because we also have to look at the supply side, which is where the resources lie. So this is not any minor matter, but often it is not on our minds, or we don't understand it well enough. And this may lead to inefficient management of economic policy, precisely when it is not properly coordinated with how the cities are oriented for production. So we're looking at some important figures for Latin America. 70% of the population is urban, 2/3 of the GDP of the countries is generated in cities, and we see that the economy is found in our territories, and they are essentially population that's in the cities. We also, if we look at the sectors, perhaps agriculture and fishing are the two sectors that are not directly linked to cities, even though they do have indirect ties, but all other sectors of the economy are in the cities, involved, so production is in the cities. And here I agree with Danny that production is in the cities, and supply side production policies need to be aligned with, or at least consistent with, the country's overall economic policy. There are some things that we must bear in mind, which are also owed to the unique production characteristic of the cities. For example, capital cities. They are bureaucratic cities, in which perhaps certain kinds of services, and even using some economic terms, have comparative advantages in terms of providing certain services. And there are other cases, such as ports, that are more trade-oriented, and their economic and productive activity is very closely linked to trade. And there are other cities that are essentially industrial cities. So we have different challenges in terms of aligning the economic policy of the country with the productive orientation of the city. You can establish policy definitions both from the national and from the perspective of each city. So I believe that this is an essential job to be done by mayors and those who are in charge of running cities. They also have to look at proper economic management, as the country say, as Danny said. And they have to do this based on the unique characteristics and tap into the comparative advantages of these cities. In this way, we can further our efforts to include citizens, and these are redistributive policies. When citizens get involved in productive activities, they're going to increase their wages and be part of the dynamic of distributing wealth within their cities. But you have to look at coordinating this with the country's economic policy, its macroeconomic policy. Often, certain contradictions may exist in this, even though there are good intentions to promote production, both in terms of national economic management and also in terms of economic management of the city or between different cities. For example, at the first level of potential conditions that need to be resolved somehow would be that an industrial city might do well to have protectionist economic activities to promote that industry, whereas a trade-oriented city wants to have more free trade. So these potential conflicts need to be resolved with some offsets or some compensation in order to empower as much as possible or to leverage the comparative advantage of the cities. But we also have to look at the handling local production in the cities. and also in terms of creating incentives for production and with tax incentives. We might impose some taxes, some practice in cities in terms of local taxes on production activities so that the city gets the resources it needs. So there are different possibilities, both in terms of cooperation and potential contradictions when there are two different levels of economic policy, and that's when we have to work very hard on this. I think that this is something that we have not yet done. Perhaps other countries, because of the way their politics are organized, they can handle these kinds of situations better. But in Latin America, this is not clear. This is not something we have seen, and there are not many studies that help us shed light on this economic form. What we seek to do is to make optimum use of the country's resources in the cities, and this is also in terms of increasing production to have greater distribution of wealth and raise the standard of living of the citizens. And then, so I'll tell you a little bit about the case of Ecuador. This is a unique situation due to several circumstances, and perhaps it's the first step in this direction. Subnational governments, particularly the largest ones in their dynamic, are following the economic management of a country, for example, in terms of financing from multilaterals. And we have the CAF here. That is an entity that has financed several of our city projects. And this entails obligations that affects the sovereign will of countries and their obligations with other multilateral organizations and creditors. So this is something that needs to be handled in coordination and carefully so that all of these financing mechanisms can be successful, so we can complete the works projects, and so that we can ensure proper fulfillment of these obligations. In the case of Ecuador, our requirements say that the debt committee, which is a national entity, has to approve any loans that are undertaken by the subnational governments. And we're also in the hands of the Republic vis-a-vis the obligations undertaken by subnational organizations. And so I think that these definitions and rules oblige us to have certain coordination and have to make this compatible with our needs and also from the financial needs of cities vis-a-vis handling national economic policy. So this is a space that I think still has to be explored extensively, and in order to do this properly and for us, for us to be able to draw any conclusions, we have to have better coordination between national macroeconomic policy, and we also have to have an economic policy at the level of cities. This could improve production in our cities and improve redistribution, and this could help us make more efficient use of natural resources. Thank you, Minister. That's very interesting. Now, in terms of coordinating macroeconomic policy at the national level with that of the cities, I think that the metro is a very good example of this. It's being funded by the CAF, the metro in the city, and the government party is different from the mayor's party in the capital city, but it's still putting together a good public transportation system. So I think we can now take some questions from the audience, and then we can close out by hearing from each of them. So could you please stand up here, identify yourself, and tell us who your question is for. I'm Alex Esteves, and I work on the performance analytics team of Portland, the city of Portland, Oregon. As is true of such cities as Montevideo and Medellin, the city of Buenos Aires has been pointed out in recent publications because of the resilience project, as Mr. Straface mentioned, and the rapid transit system and others. So I'm looking at the commitment of the mayor's government. I know about this in the United States. We have access to a lot of data, and it often makes it easy to put together performance metrics and to monitor them. So now it's very hard to get a commitment from decision makers and from the mayor in our case in terms of targets. So my question is, was this a difficult process? Then how did the process go? Did the mayor commit to some of these? Okay, we'll take a couple, 2 or 3 questions. Yes, over here. Thank you. I'm Laura Agosta. I work a nonprofit in international projects. I'm always very impressed by Medellin. I was able to go there, and I looked at the library and other institutions. My question has to do with drug trafficking and young people. These types of problems often require national federal support, but in the city, what effective and non-punitive policies were applied in terms of prevention and protection? Which were the most effective ones in terms of these 3 E's that you mentioned? And the scourge of drugs amongst young people. Thank you. Next, over here. Second row, over there. Good afternoon. I'm Diana Almeida, and I work for the Advocacy Project, but my question is on my personal behalf. For all of the panelists, what are the main barriers that you find to coordination between the central government and your territory when you try to coordinate city policies with national government policies? Thank you. Last question over there. 4th row. Good afternoon. I'm Jorge Rodriguez. I'm the coordinator of Primero Justicia in Venezuela. As regards the creation of smart cities, of course, you have to take into account the participation of citizens. How can you encourage people to participate when we have such a high crime rate like we have in Venezuela? And secondly, what is the best option for recreation? The second question is for Aníbal Gaviria.
Con respecto, yo trabajé en la alcaldía de
I worked in the mayor's office in Sucre, and I'd like to know how effective the 10 million pesos that it cost to put in the escalators in the Independencia area, and what do you think the future is for this? Thank you. We'll stop there, and we'll start with the general question for everyone. What are the barriers to coordination between municipal or city and national government? I'd like to answer because I have to run to catch my flight. Yes, okay. I hope you're not flying to Miami or through Miami. No, I'm sorry, I'm not. I'm going north. Irma's rerouting me north. No, I just like to congratulate everyone. It's been a very interesting opportunity to hear about what all of these great cities are doing. And we have the Ruta N, which is an interesting space, and this is a strategic project to create a critical mass of knowledge. And these types of things that allow us to get to know each other, and they also see that we can't have a linear transfer of each of these because each country has unique characteristics and culture. But I've really been very pleased to be able to participate in this panel and to hear from my distinguished colleagues. And excuse me, but I really am going to miss my flight if I don't go now. All right, thank you. All right, then let's continue. We're going to leave Aníbal to the end, who has two questions, but
To better coordination.
Perfect.
Yeah, so I think I would start where the minister left off about misalignment. I think there's an intermediate level between cities and national governments, and they are either provinces, states, whatever you want to call it. And I think it's more the case than not that those barriers or misalignments are damaging to the development of cities. So I happen to know a little bit more about Argentina than some other countries. So I would say that, with due respect, that Buenos Aires may not be the example, but there are other provinces where the political barrier is at the provincial level. It's not that the city doesn't have, an idea of where it would like to go, and the national government as well. But the provincial level is difficult. It's politically difficult, and I don't think that there's a great coordination often at that level. And you can look at revenue sharing mechanisms in Argentina as one such example. Another barrier, I think, is when you get to metropolitan development, right? You're cutting across boundaries. Right? We have the problem here in D.C., right? We can't allocate properly to maintain the metro because it cuts across three jurisdictions, and everybody's looking out for their interest, and there's a collective action problem. You get to a bad solution when everyone's looking out only for their interest. So I think coordination is the key, right? And I think that Colombia, for better or for worse, seems to have done it reasonably well. Whether that is a function of having the DNP and some sort of a planning function that operates or not, we don't know. But it stands out in Latin America for having a ministry that has to do that kind of work. I guess there's been decentralization politically in Colombia, but it seems to have been managed reasonably well. So I think the barriers, to make it brief, are political, and they impede you from coming to what could be the smarter, to use your terminology, economic solution. And I think that's the problem.
Thank you very much, Danny. Vamos a pasar, ministro, para poner...
Thank you, Danny. Minister, in order to have a positive approach from the standpoint of the central administration, how can we have better communication and work with the municipal governments or city governments? Whenever there is a dialogue, we can improve such coordination. However, always seeding this idea that there's a need for coordination and productive impulse. There are certain dimensions of coordination which take place between the state and the cities. However, this coordination does not necessarily follow the approach that we have been mentioning. And the idea to bring about awareness that this coordination is necessary is but a first step. Are there political barriers? Yes, but it depends on how every country works, how each country has defined its political and institutional structures, and how is it that the various political forces operate. The idea that suits have to be custom-made, I agree with that idea to the extent necessary and possible. But this is a dynamic exercise that has to change according to timing and circumstances, and we must necessarily work on the basis of a situation which is not static. Thank you, Minister. I thank you for your readiness to work within a panel of cities on which where the ministers of finance and several of those here have been ministers of finance, and those are the ones who decide how resources are to be invested and distributed. We thank you so very much for your having been with us this afternoon. Fernando, besides general questions, there were some questions regarding Buenos Aires. Could you please reply? Yes, very briefly. Democracy undergoes a basic contract relationship, which is that between the represented and those who represent them. But there's also the aspect having to do with delivery, having public goods which are expected from a government. That is where the cities play the role, and where the mayors end up by being re-elected or not, to the extent that they comply with such delivery. Our mayor is truly obsessive as far as measuring what we do, and also becoming committed vis-a-vis the citizens and neighbors as to what he has planned to do. So I suggest that you go to Buenos Aires 2.R government commitments, compromisos de gobierno, and you'll find that there are 50 of them along 4 axes. Human scale cities, enjoy and coexistence and innovation, and which cover many of the policies I described earlier, where the mayor is committed toward a concrete target throughout his mandate or his tenure, and how this is going to be complied with, and how information may be generated so that any of the neighbors may have access and see how we're performing. She also presents information regarding each one of the commitments every 6 months. This is a true effort of accountability and data analysis. And this is a phenomenon that does not respect hemispheres or ideological orientation or income levels. Look at what's happening here in the United States between President Trump and some governors with regard to the Paris Agreement, when the president said that the government is leaving, and some governors said we will remain, we will stay. What happens between, for example, President Trump and the mayor of Chicago, which are about to intervene, such as a designated survivor. So this happens in all the countries. Aníbal, the last few words. There were several questions. Please go ahead. Yes, first the general question regarding barriers and the nation-city relationship. These are political barriers in the broadest sense of the term. In other words, political obligations by the city and the nation sometimes are in conflict, as Carlos was telling us. And this indeed has to be a matter of dialogue and seeking out the means to make them coincide and agree. But there are also other barriers that I would call politicking barriers. Barriers when the president pertains to a party and the mayor pertains to another political party, and there's a struggle in order to impose the agenda of the one over the other, and this results in terrible detriment for the city and the nation as a whole as well. In order to try to see this from a positive standpoint, I'll say that the transcendental element, in order to try to reduce those politicking and political tensions as well, we have organizations such as CAF, and this comes together with the issues of the funding that we mentioned earlier, and also the transcendental concept of stability and continuity. Regarding those elements, alignment, planning, funding, and stability, CAF and other multilaterals indeed have a basic task to carry out, because they have the possibility of thinking and working in the long term with cities and states to accompany those plans, to fund them, and to reduce and avoid as far as possible all that lack of alignment and politicking conflicts, and also the changes in the case of the tenure periods of the mayors, which are 4 years. So I would make a plea and a suggestion, which might be somewhat disruptive. I haven't had a chance to tell my very good friend Pepe already, why isn't it that CAF breaks with the scheme, and besides being a bank of nations, to become a bank of cities, combining both things. In the future, in the board of CAF, I would like to see mayors as members as well, so that mayors will be together with the nations. Within the capital of the cities that have the strength and the power to be present. In Latin America, 28 countries, 22 of them are smaller than Mexico City. Just 6 countries in Latin America. Mexico City is the 7th largest country, in quotes, in Latin America. Same thing with cities such as Buenos Aires, Lima, or Bogota, Rio de Janeiro, or Sao Paulo. The other issue has to do with what was mentioned by Laura. Your question allows me to make a comment which comes together with other remarks made in other panels, has to do with drug trafficking. I have conducted a campaign, and I've tried to be convincing, that we remove that name from that problem, because by using drug trafficking, they placed us with a marking. But it is not a problem of drug trafficking whatsoever. It is a problem of a chain of crimes of illicit drugs, where there are narco precursors, narco funding, narco trafficking, and narco harvests. But everybody calls it drug trafficking, and we too call it drug trafficking. So what about the drug funders or financiers and countries who allow them? What about drug consumption, which is indeed the beginning of the entire cycle, or the end that results in the beginning of this circle again, and to have to be co-responsible regarding a global problem. And I would say then that the issues and problems of drug trafficking and the other elements and the utilization of drugs is one of the elements that promotes all the other aspects which are fed from inequality. And their seriousness in our cities and in our country have to do with our greatest riches, our greatest wealth in Medellin, that we are a young city, impressively young town, filled with the energy of young people. So what can a young person do if they have no opportunities of education and employment? That young person, those millions of people, are thrown over the cliff of drugs and crime. And this is a problem which affects other aspects as well, but I'm focusing basically on opportunities. And the two greatest opportunities are study and work. So our most important effort has been there precisely, to take those young people away from the pathway of death, criminality, and drugs, and bring them to the virtuous pathway of communication, learning, and work. Just to conclude discussion of some of the points that were mentioned, one of the issues regarding the strategy is that we have built educational citadels, as we call them, new university campuses. One of the most symbolic of these that we're building we started construction in my administration. It's called the University City of Art and Culture. And the important thing is that that citadel is there where there used to be a jail during 100 years. The women's prison in Medellin, it worked as such for 100 years. We demolished it, and we're now building an educational citadel, as we call it. The combination of education with opportunity, and the public space of true quality. What about all the neighbors of that district, which such as number 31? It is number 13. The numbers in reverse, a palindrome. And there is where we built this city precisely. And in order to conclude with the discussion of the escalators, I don't know, the escalators were started during the administration prior to mine. I had the pleasure of finishing their construction. I am sure that studies have been made about some of the urban innovations, as well as the elements that have made Medellin a true laboratory of urban innovation, such as the petrol cables or escalators, which allow for us to study their implications and results. Perhaps an econometrical study, I don't know if it would give a positive result. However, the context of the investment and its meaning does show that. These escalators are in Comuna number 13 also. So, these have resulted in a true transformation of that environment, which was extremely violent. Obviously, they have a true meaning and sense, because that section of Medellin, which was a very steep mountain, and all citizens living on that hillside had to climb some 500 steps, and think of what this represents with a mother carrying a child or an adult who's carrying some wares. Now they can do and connect themselves and go up and down, and this has resulted in a transformation of that environment because it has become a tourist area, one of the places which is now being visited by inhabitants from other places in Medellin, from other countries and other cities in Colombia. They go there as tourists. So this is now a matter of pride and identity. Those citizens who did not exist before are there now. As a conclusion, I can say that if you look at the various elements of investments such as this one, if we see them in a comprehensive manner, has been extremely beneficial for the city as a whole. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to ask for a round of applause for the panel members. And with that, I'd like to take advantage to thank the Inter-American Dialogue, the Organization of American States, and CAF, and to declare closed this 21st CAF conference in Washington, D.C., which has been extremely interesting. We have spoken about the new order in Latin America, how Trump fits in, who has been mentioned from various perspectives and outlooks, as well as his regional policies. We also reviewed what happened with Latin America after the boom, the issues of corruption, the political cycle, which was tremendously active, and finally the issues regarding cities. Thank you all, and we hope to see you next year again.